Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Mirror Media podcast today. You are joined by me, your host, Mukunda Raghavan, and we have two special guests today, Nithin Sridhar, who is you could call him the curator of the Advaita Academy, which is an online uh, academy in which one can learn about Advaita and basically the information about Vedanta. And secondarily, he's also a published author. His first book was um, on menstruation across the cultures in India, and then he recently wrote his book on Samanya Dharma, which interestingly enough we'll cover parts of that today. And his new book that's coming out, and I think shortly should be a commentary on the Isha Vasha Upanishad. So, Nithin, welcome to the program. Hi, how are you?
Thank you. Thank you
Hi,
for inviting me.
absolutely. It's a pleasure to have you. And our second guest today is Aditi Banerjee, who is an attorney at a Fortune 500 company in New York. She is also author of quite a few books, including a book about invading the sacred, which she wrote, I think, a few years ago, about 10 years ago, I think, or so. And additionally, she just released her new book called The Curse of Gandhari that came out just about a year ago. About basically about the story of Gandhari and aftermath of the Mahabharata War. So Aditi is a graduate of law school from Yale Law School. So it's not that she's very intelligent. She just kind of made it through. But it's Yale, right? Anyone gets in. I'm just kidding. So in her free time, she loves to travel the Himalayas and loves to read. Aditi, welcome to the program. How are you?
Namaste. Thank you so much, Mukunda, for having us, and Shubh Navratri to everyone.
That's right, Shubha Navratri. This is it's been a week.
Yep.
I believe. Awesome. Okay, so we have a very interesting conversation today that we're going to cover, which is primarily going to be about it's primarily going to be about the Dharma Shastras and the history of the Dharma Shastras and kind of what their relevance in today's world is. So, let's start off with the first question for everybody here, which I think is quite relevant. Is what is Dharma? Why is it important? So let's just start with you, Aditi. What is Dharma according to your view, and what's so important about it?
Sure. So Dharma is very much related to Ritam, or a cosmic order or balance. And it's basically, there are many shades of meaning, but one is that which upholds. So you start from the perspective of Loka Sangraha. What is the greatest good for the greatest number of people? What is the cosmic order and balance? And it is also something that it's not static, it's dynamic. So you're always trying to find this balance among the forces and things like that. So that's at a very cosmic level. When you bring it down to the societal level, you have different types of dharma. So there's varnashrama dharma. So there's dharma for different people. Then there's dharma based on one's position in society. So there could be Stri dharma, there could be Purusha dharma, there could be Raja dharma. And then there is something which we say as swadharma, which is the dharma of the self. Sometimes that gets interpreted incorrectly to mean that which you want to do or that which you like to do. It's much more complicated than that. It's based on the individual's circumstances, individual's karmas, individual's psyche, and what is right for them at that moment. And what makes dharma different from other concepts of morality or even ethics, while the ethics comes closer to it, is it's very situational. So it's not a fixed set of rules or commandments, but it's based on the situation that you're in, based on the time, the place, and the context, and you yourself as an individual, what is appropriate at that moment. And then you're balancing all these different types of dharma in that moment, which is why to understand dharma is a very subtle process. and it becomes a subtle and sensitive question. So I'll stop there because I know a lot more of what I would discuss we're going to cover later.
So Nithin, what are your thoughts? What is Dharma according to you? And yeah.
Aditi has covered it pretty comprehensively already, and I completely agree with what she says. Perhaps I would just like to add one or two small points to just add it to what she said. See, one of the definitions of dharma, one is of course that what she said, dharanat dharmamiti that which upholds his dharma. But the question arises then, what does this upholding means? And especially, what does it mean in a human context? See, a cosmic context, it is there. We have the terms like rita, etc. But in the individual context, because ultimately we are all interested in as as a human about our actions, and dharma is related to that. So what would it mean in individual context? So we have this definition in one of the darshanas which says yato abhyudaya nishreyasa siddhihi sa dharma. This is in Vaisheshika Sutras. Basically it means that dharma is that which imparts, which facilitates a person to attain abhyudaya and nishreyasa. So now these two terms are very specific. They have a specific technical definition. Abhyudaya refers to material well-being, fulfillment of artha and kama, the material well-being, including the pravritti aspect of dharma as well. So overall material well-being is abhyudaya. Dharma is able to give this to a person who follows dharma, and that is all the actions which are considered as dharma, or those which is able to give abhyudaya. At the same time, it is also able to take one towards nishreyasa. Nishreyasa is ultimate moksha, it is ultimate jnana, which is the, while abhyudaya is temporary happiness, nishreyasa is anandam, the eternal bliss. So dharma is that which facilitates, it refers to all those actions which facilitate one to attain them. So this is a definition in an individual context, and as Aditi said, this definition manifests in a multiple number of ways. But two major distinction we can make. One is the samanya dharma, which is the ethical aspect. For example, Manusmriti says ahimsa satyam asteyam shaucham indriya nigraham. It gives these 5 points as ahimsa satya, that is truth, non-injury, sense and self-control, control of mind and senses, and purification of the body, mind, and heart. So all these as, and non-stealing. These as 5 principles of Samanya Dharma. These are ethical duties, and it is not just ethics are obligatory. By calling it them as dharma, they are kind of, they're obligatory. They are not left to chance, right? And the other is Vishesha Dharma, which I can translate as a kind of a special Dharma or a tailor-made Dharma for each individual based on his station in life, ashrama, his varna in life, his jati, his kula, his whether he is a son or a father or various kinds of time, yuga, everything matters. So it's a tailor-made special kind of actions or a duty or obligations that would help him to attain these, abhyudaya and nishreyasa. So I think this definition is mostly what is most relevant to us in a day-to-day aspect. And we find another relationship between Rita, Satya, and Dharma. And in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad and other places, we find that, there is verses which says that what is in speech, dharma, satya is dharma in speech, and dharma is satya in action. I mean, there should be a sync between our thought, our speech, and action. And so these are a lot of nuances are there, but basically it's about all those actions that can lead one towards abhyudaya and nishreyasa.
So I think you guys both covered it pretty comprehensively. I mean, the only thing I would add is, the Mahabharata is very particular and very unique in that even though it talks quite a bit about dharma, it has examples of both practice that is followed, and then vichara, which is practices that kind of diverge but are still within the realm of dharma, right? One of the things that Mahabharata is dharma dhareti prajaha, right? The dharma is that which upholds and sustains beings or prajas, life. And so it's also important to understand. And while you did list the five, Mahabharata goes deeper. It's satya, danam, tapa, kshama, yajna, Dhamma, Swadhyaya, Alobha, Krodha, and Anir Shamshaya, and Ahimsa, right? They list a bunch of qualities that are considered dharma, right? Like, one of the, as many times as we hear Ahimsa in the Mahabharata, Ahimsa Paramo Dharma, you hear nearly as many times Anir Shamshaya Paramo Dharma, right? The concept that non-cruelty in action, deed, and speech is just as important as nonviolence. And non-cruelty is sometimes taken to be the highest in many ways, because of the nature of life requires some level of violence. But even when violence is done, how it's done should be non-cruel, right? But these principles are in many ways are supposed to be guiding principles, along with the other two, with treat others as they treat you, which in numerous different ways it's stated in the Mahabharata, and also treating all beings with love. Yasman yata vitartati. There's so much in Mahabharata that talks about this, about how we should treat each other. But dharma, in some sense, is still action, right? It just means right action in some ways. There's still karmic consequences in relation to dharma. So why should anyone follow dharma as opposed to adharma, and if both of them lead to consequences? Like dharmic actions can lead to negative consequences sometimes, and adharmic actions can lead to positive consequences. So why should a particular person follow dharma? Either of you, go ahead.
So again, you're looking at dharma as so one thing is just look at individual actions and like papa and punya. That's one way, but that's a narrow way. When you're looking at dharma, first of all, you're looking at dharma in the context of the purushartha. So dharma, artha, kama, moksha. And as Nithin was also saying, dharma is what leads you to your own contentment and ultimately to the higher realization. And then when you're looking at a societal perspective, you want something that is sustainable, and that when you're going about your own karmas, you're not creating a great deal of harm to the environment, to others in society, to future generations, things like that. So it's a model of sustainability where you can still pursue wealth and desires within a dharmic framework, but it's sustainable where it's not ruining your own self and binding you further to samsara, which leads to more suffering, and is also not harming others. So it's a way of balancing all these things again in a sustainable way for the self and for society. So dharma harmonizes the individual goals and desires with the impact on society and the long-term well-being of society as a whole, so that everyone can pursue their purushartha again in a sustainable way.
So, the only pushback I would have to give here is, in some ways, I don't know if dharma is fundamentally has anything to do with moksha, right? Or the sense of unfetteredness to the world and karmic responsibility. It seems to me, dharma, and we'll get into this shortly about what are the sources of dharma, but it seems to me that dharma itself is a binding activity, correct? It is it's an activity that binds us to other actions. It's go ahead, Nithin, you're about to say something.
Yeah, I'm just about to respond to that. See, that which is binding is karma, action. and not dharma per se. See, what is dharma or what is karma, adharma? It's a basically an analysis of action. See, for example, in Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, what actions to be performed, what actions to be not performed, we have to know from Shastra. So we'll come to that Shastra part later. But basically, this distinction between dharma and adharma is a distinction between actions that lead to our well-being, that is the punya that generates the merit, karmic merit, and the actions that generates karmic demerit. So dharma by definition, I mean, it is not that dharma is something that is outside of karma. It is that action themselves can be divided into two aspects, as dharma, as adharma. So you cannot say, I mean, so that is one thing. But there are the other part of it is, for example, Adi Shankaracharya in Gita introduction speaks about two kinds of dharma. One is pravritti dharma and nivritti dharma. So the pravritti dharma is a dharma that is related to this world, wherein we pursue the dharma, artha, kama in the Purushartha framework. And the nivritti dharma is about pursuing of moksha. But even there, though action not lead to moksha, but before that, there are processes that involves action. For example, without dharma anushtana, there cannot be no chitta shuddhi. Without chitta shuddhi, you do not have competency to do Shravana Chatushtaya or the Vedanta sadhana, without which cannot gain Atmagyana and Moksha. So the point here is, when we speak about dharma, yes, dharma and adharma, the both speak about, as far as human activity is concerned, they speak about actions. Even the whole Purushartha itself, what is Purushartha? Purusha Artha. So that usually it is translated as the purpose of life. But in a deeper sense, if you take up the Mimamsa text and all, you will see it refers to the entire kind of the whole bunch of human activities, the whole range of human activities. It's a vision wherein all human activities, all human desires, all human pursuits can be grouped into four broader categories of dharma, artha, kama, moksha. So the point here is, you made a statement one that dharma can also lead to may also lead to bad results, right? But that is not true. Dharma by definition is that which gives merit, karmic merit. True, it is possible that when you are traveling a path on dharma, you may face obstacles in this life. You may face sorrow. For example, Rama faced lot of sorrow in his life, but he was dharma vigraha. He was the embodiment of dharma. But that the circumstances that the sorrow that he was facing, or forget Rama, any person, normal person will face, it is not because of performance of dharma per se. The life that we face today, the people we meet, the situations we are placed, it is all the result of our karmic actions performed in previous lives. So we need to understand the whole thing within the framework of karma, within the broader framework of the karmic system of the birth and death, the whole cycle.
So Nithin, I mean, I don't know if I entirely agree with that, right? I don't think that's correct. I don't think it's correct to say dharma only produces good phala, because we know from at least from the Mahabharata directly itself, there are numerous instances where dharma is pitted against dharma, like the story that Krishna gives to Arjuna about the rishi that chooses the dharma of satya, speaking the truth, over dharma of compassion, of nonviolence, anirshamshya. So a dharma itself can lead to good or bad results, and the whole Mahabharata.
I think you're confusing two different things here. Let me just quickly make a point. See, dharma by definition is that which leads to abhyudaya nishreyas, and that definition cannot be changed. The point you are speaking about with the example that you gave from Mahabharata, this is a condition called as dharma sankata, wherein two or more modes of actions conflict with each other, and in such complicated real life situations, you can say, see, there is one aspect of theoretical guidelines, do this is good, this, but in practice what happens, it often we will be faced with choices. None of
Yeah.
them are completely white or completely black. There
Yeah.
will
Yeah.
be in different shades. So we will have to take a decision, and that decision, that karma will give karma phala.
Yeah.
But you know, yes,
Which can be
right?
either good or bad, right? So a dharmic action.
Yes.
Yeah, can I
Go
jump
ahead.
in for a moment?
Go ahead.
So let's take the example of when Yudhishthir tells Dronacharya that Ashwatthama has died, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So he is told a lie. So that's you can say in a sense that's a small dharma in the service of a greater dharma that he had to
Yes.
do.
Yes.
Now, what you're saying is correct in that there is a karmic consequence because he tells that lie. His feet touch the ground. Before he was walking a little bit above the ground, but now his feet touch the ground. Is that in a sense a karmic demerit in the sense that there's some suffering for it? Yes. But on the whole, you would not say that's a bad thing because he has done this for the higher dharma.
Sure.
So I think that's the way that you that you look at it.
Absolutely. But I guess my point to this. Go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
I wanted to make another point about what you're saying about dharma does not lead to moksha. So in the sense it is correct that there's no causality for moksha, there's no linkage of you need to do X, Y, Z for moksha, and that it's correct. But from the perspective of sadhana, which ripens the mind for those higher realizations, it is important that one have vairagya, viveka, one not be too much attached to the things of the senses. Otherwise, it's not possible to think of those higher things. So at an individual level, dharma is important for that, for some of those preconditions for the paths that lead, that make one purified, one for those higher pursuits. And then if you look at it from a societal perspective, in any society, someone can get enlightened. That is correct. But you would find in dharmic societies, by which I mean Hindu society, Buddha society, Jain society, there is a much more focus on the spiritual life. And as a whole, it is much more conducive to these to a life of spiritual practice, and therefore the causes and conditions that take one towards the path of enlightenment tend to be more prominent in dharmic societies than other societies because of the values and principles that are embedded in that framework. So I think that's an important point.
Yes. I mean, I I agree. I agree in a large part. I just tend to come at it from a perspective that we've discussed Dharma, especially both in theoretical and practical sense. We have to recognize the deep complexity of Dharma because it's not. I mean, it's there in the, and we'll get into the sources, which is important. But like in many ways, maybe it betrays uh, my own focus on a text like Mahabharata over many other texts. I find it to be much more instructive about the complexity and the difficulty of understanding Dharma from even a theoretical perspective. What I mean, like the Charana Shloka of the Gita is what Sarva Dharman Parityaja Mamekam Sharanvaja, right? So what does he mean there? Obviously, I don't think he necessarily means give up your dharma in everyday life in the way we think about it. I think it's a much more mental kind of giving up of dharma in the sense of give up the karma pala related to it and see yourself as becoming an instrument, his nimitta in many ways. But I think there is something to be said when people do say that dharma itself, because I mean Krishna multiple times throughout the Gita also indicates that the dharma itself is related to the three gunas, and that for Arjuna to rise above the three gunas and focus on atma jnana and things of that nature. So I do think that dharma, in some sense, is mostly about the concept of which you said earlier, which is lokasamgraha and yogakshema, right? About the upliftment and sustenance of the world or the community or of individuals in a much more I would say much more moral, physical way than maybe necessarily fully spiritual, but it's guided by spiritual principles. That's just a thought that I have right now. So if you want to respond to that, we
See,
can.
I think I just want to make a comment here.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right in a sense, but I think the point is, see, in Hindu tradition, we tend to use the terms in a different sense in a different context. So that also gives rise to some kind of confusion.
Hmm.
For example, Dharma, I just mentioned a while back that Shankara says about pravritti dharma and nivritti dharma.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so when we speak about Trivarga, that moksha is included within dharma in the sense of pravritti dharma, and we will find this sense even in Manusmriti. In the first chapter of Manusmriti is for cosmogony, and the objection arises, why should we speak about cosmogony, about srishti in a text on dharma which should be about human actions, right?
Hmm.
So the commentator answers this objection by speaking about how the srishti is about nivritti dharma, it's about Parabrahman, and he is the primary dharma. His pursuit is the primary dharma. He is the source of dharma, and he is the angi, and his anga is this pravritti dharma, that is dharma of the world. That your yogakshema and lokasangraha.
Yeah.
So I think what the tradition holds is that there is a different perspective. You can approach it either from a macrocosm to microcosm or microcosm to macrocosm. But
Sure.
however you see it, there is one aspect which is nivritti dharma, which is deals with this, freedom from the cycle of birth and death. How using karma itself, we slowly attain chitta shuddhi, and then through jnanam we move out of this cycle of birth and death. And the other is pravritti dharma, how to function within this cycle of birth and death in an effective manner by attaining happiness, sukha, in the form of artha, kama, and dharma, right?
Yeah.
So this is a more complementary. It involves both these actions, and depending upon the context, we tend to focus on only one aspect or the other aspect. So that is why sometimes it leads to confusion.
Hmm. Aditi,
Yeah, I
anything?
get that. Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment on when you pointed out the shloka from the Gita about sarva dharma parityaja. See, that is it is a statement of bhakti. So the idea is, if you can truly surrender yourself to Krishna or to Ishvara in any form. So the classical story is there of the gopis, right? And so it says that the gopis were attracted to Krishna, and the idea comes that they're not attracted to Krishna because he's Ishvara. They love him, and their love for him is so pure that they say, even if because of our bhakti to him, we have to go to hell and we stay in hell forever, that is fine, because that is how much we love Krishna. If you have that kind of sharanagati to Sri Krishna, then you don't have to worry about what is my dharma in this moment, what should I do, what should I think. He will take care of all of that. And the example is there in the Ramanuja Sampradaya of like the way that the cat carries a kitten in its mouth. You are so surrendered that the cat takes care, or your mother takes care of everything for you. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to think about these things. So even within dharma, it's so broad, and there's so much depth that there are many different paths. So that is also one path if one has the adhikara to follow that path of sharanagati.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, since I belong to that school of thought, I guess.
There is a sorry, I want to just
Yeah. Go ahead.
interrupt. There is a very beautiful assertion in, I think, Bhagavad Purana, which says one has to follow this dharma anushtana, the varnashrama and all this anushtanam, till either one develops vairagya such that they can do karma sannyasa and follow the jnana marga to mukti, or one develops complete sharanagati to the deity such that he can then adopt Bhagavata Dharma and follow the Bhakti Yoga path. So I think this matches with what Aditi is saying. Once either one develops Vairagyam or one develops this deep Bhakti, then the rules of the game changes. They shift from Pravritti Marga to a Nivritti Marga. So this is another interesting aspect of the issue.
Right. I mean, if we focus on the Gita entirely, we can talk about, various points where he says, pravrittim cha nivrittim cha karya bhayabe, moksham, he talks about giving up any of these concepts, these ideas. And then he goes into, that's when he talks about sharanagati in that sense. But, I think we can shift a little bit of focus. I mean, these topics are so interconnected. We'll come back to this anyway. That I think we should jump to maybe let's talk about what are the sources of Dharma. How do we know Dharma? It is a very difficult thing to understand and know. Like if we talk about Dharma to a regular, a woman, man on the street or anywhere else, how do we tell them what is Dharma, what is not Dharma? How can they find out for themselves?
Shall I take this question?
Sure, you can start.
Yeah. See, there is a very interesting verse in, I think, one of the Smritis or the Dharma Sutras, which says, the actions do not come and speak saying that I am Dharma, I am Adharma. So the point it is making is it cannot be completely based on human thinking. In the sense, I can justify my actions in some ways or the other, and other person can justify a reverse action in some way or the other. That is, we can all justify our own action saying that we are all doing the right thing. So our exclusively a human argument or a logical argument cannot be a proper source for dharma. So then the question is, what is the source? See, I hope I can take a few minutes to explain here. So we have in Indian philosophy 6 kinds of pramanas, that is valid sources of knowledge: pratyaksha, anumana, anupalabdhi, and upamana, and shabda, etc. We cannot apply pratyaksha or anumana, etc. to know the dharma, because see, by seeing the world we cannot make a judgment whether something is ethical or not. At best we can make a guesswork, right? So the only pramana that holds the Hindu tradition that can give this knowledge about what is dharma, what is not, what action is good for us, what is not good for us, is shabda pramana or shastra pramana. So this is the only when we say that shastra pramana or something is a pramana, shastra is a pramana for dharma, it means what it means is that shastra is an independent source of knowledge, independent than all other sources, and it is valid in itself, and it can and what it reveals, what it says, cannot be known from any other valid sources, any other valid pramanas, and other valid pramanas cannot falsify the knowledge that is revealed by the shastra. So I'm giving this background because this point is very important. For example, the Veda, for example, says you perform certain yagyas, you attain swarga after death. This is a knowledge which is not revealed by any other source. You cannot know it from pratyaksha, anumana, or logic, or any other reasoning. Similarly, Smritis, for example, says menstruation in a woman is purifies her. It's a purification process in itself, and it purifies her of impure thoughts. This is something again which we know from the Shastra, and no other sources reveals this. So Shastra is the pramana, is the valid source for knowing dharma. So what Shastras is the next question. In fact, even in Gita, the Bhagavan Krishna says that to know what actions to do and what actions not to do, Shastra alone is the pramana. So what are these Shastras? In Manusmriti, we have a very the description of how to understand it. First is the Vedo Akhilam Dharma Moolam. Veda is the ultimate source because it is apaurishayam. It is not of human origin, so there is no scope for human error. And then comes, based on this Veda, because Veda is infinite, it is infinite knowledge. Though the current surviving Vedic texts are very small minority, very small bunch of texts, the actual Veda is infinite. And the rishis who lived much before us and who were much more knowledgeable than us, and they knew this Veda in entirety, they composed what is called as smritis based on their recollection of the Vedic knowledge. For the sake of the humans, they composed smritis in the form of vidhi nishedas, or in the form of guidelines. And then we have this, the third source of valid source is Sheila, the acharas of the great ones, like, what we know from Itihasa Puranas, or what we know from our own ancestors, good ancestors, our gurus, elders, etc. And finally is Atmatushti, our own conscience, our own inner conscience. So, I mean, as I see it, the Manus actually gives a 4-staged process to help an individual to decide in any situation what is the best course of action he has to take. He cannot decide it on his own completely. So, the force filtering is the Vedas teachings are quite abstract, and then they are made more practical in Smriti teachings, and they are further interpreted in Mahabharata and Ramayana and Itihasas. I consider Mahabharata as a running commentary on Manusmriti and other texts, because it gives us, it tells us how this that the injunctions, the advices of Smritis can be applied in different situations in different ways. And from these all the learnings, when we have by using our intellect, we have to finally decide what is the best course of action in our situation, because though it may appear that two people are in a similar situation, it is not same, so it could be different. So so when we speak about what is the sources of knowledge, so we have this, the Veda, and then we have the Smritis and other Dharma Shastras, including Itihasa, Puranas, Mimamsa, etc. And then we have the actions of our ancestors, our gurus and elders. And then finally, we have our own inner conscience. So this is the framework that the tradition gives us to comprehensively understand Dharma. As you said a while back, that Dharma is very complex, especially the practical application is very complex. And I understand your love for Mahabharata, because I love it too.
Yeah. So Aditi, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so like Nithin said, that those sources of dharma are also mentioned in the Yajnavalkya Samhita. So the Shruti, the Smriti, the Achara. And the Achara, again, is the customs or behavior of those wise ones in society. And then it's also those who are living consistent with the Vedas. And Manusmriti also says elsewhere, it's not opposed to things that are not in the Vedas, so long as those sources are not in conflict with and are consistent with the Vedas. And then you have this Atma Tushti concept also, which Nithin had also mentioned. Now, so that is correct. So those are the sources of dharma. Now, I'd like to comment on a few different aspects. One is that usually, let's say I have a question about what to do. Like I want to have my son's Upanayanam. I don't know when to have it. Most of us do not have a copy of the Dharma Shastras in our home that we are going to look up and find an answer. We would call a trusted Purohit, or we'd call our guru, or we'd resort to our family elders. So there's a very important aspect of how the Dharma Shastras are interpreted and applied. And the whole Sampradaya Parampara system, I think, is very important in further modulating what we mean by dharma in different situations. So most of us will go to someone who we trust as an authority of dharma, and that person should be at least should be Shrotriya and know the Shastras, so they should have that appropriate knowledge and training. They should also be Brahmanishta, in the sense that they should have the Tapobala, the Antakarna Shuddhi, where they can understand from this entire corpus of Shastras that you have. And sometimes you have verses, they're not conflicting because there's Samanvaya and everything. But if you just read it, a lay reader may have confusion on which one applies or what does this mean in connection with that. And you need to have Adhikara to be able to interpret it appropriately. And so in a very practical sense, most of us do not try to be lawyers or Dharma Shastra interpreters on our own because we frankly don't have that adhikara, but we go to someone who has that adhikara, and different sampradayas and paramparas will have their interpretations or how they apply that. And if you go to an acharya, that acharya may tell one person one thing based on their situation and another person something else based on that person's situation. And this is very important to understand, because I think a lot of the misunderstanding that comes when we talk about Manusmriti is we do not understand this context about the sources of Dharma and how it was applied. It's not like when Westerners come, they read it as a moral code. There's a list of precepts and you read it very literally and that's it. And that's very wrong. So like the Manusmriti is like, it's a guidebook to Dharma. It has things, as Nithin was saying, on the cosmogony and other things. It's not just like a list of rules or precepts. It's something much more richer and dynamic than that. And that context and how it has actually been practically lived and understood and transmitted needs to be understood.
Yeah.
So I would like to add one thing to what Aditi said. She made a point about most of us do not have Manusmriti or any other Dharmashastra text at home, which is correct. But I have been hearing on Twitter and all that that this is something negative. I mean, people say that, look, people have Gita at their homes, but they don't have Manusmriti at their home. So Manusmriti or any other Dharmashastra does not matter. They are not central to Hinduism. They are not central to Dharma. They make no. They are simply outdated. But this is a very wrong understanding. This basically is because of a fundamental misunderstanding of the function of Shastra at all. First of all, the first point is the prevalence of Gita in all our homes is actually a modern phenomena, perhaps last 100 years, especially thanks to efforts of Swami Chinmayananda and other such sampradayas. But this was not too much prevalent before, say 200, 300 years back, perhaps. But more importantly, Dharma Shastras are not supposed to be a text which is kept in each other's house. That is not its purpose at all. It was always meant to be studied by a select few who dedicate their lives to that study, who dedicate their lives to understanding the nuances of Dharma, so the entire society on the nuances of Dharma. The kings used to study it, the pandits used to study it, those who they used to dedicate their lives to it, and they used to derive the principles from there and guide people. As Aditi was saying, the Manusmriti is not a law book, or nor it is a 10 commandment book. It is basically, or Manusmriti, any Dharma Shastra, any of the different smritis that is there, they are basically pramanas, sources of knowledge about dharma, what is adharma, and what kind of results a particular action provides us. So, and I just take a few minutes more to explain one aspect here. See, we speak about Veda and the Smritis, etc., speaking about Vidhi and Nisheda. Vidhi is injunction, Nisheda is prohibition, prescription and prohibition. It is so, but here there is a catch here. It is not about whether we believe it and we are bound by that belief. No, it is not like that. Here, what is considered as vidhi, as I said, you perform this yajna, you get this swarga, or you do not murder someone, because if you murder someone, you get this kind of narak. This is basically a revelatory, in the sense of this is giving us knowledge that you perform this karma and you will get this karma phala. These shastras are actually telling us what karma leads to what kind of karma phala. They are binding in the sense that a particular karma will have particular consequences. They are not binding in the sense that we have to have a faith in it, we have to compulsorily practice it. No, the choice is always there for us to practice it or not to practice it, or how much to practice it, based on our conditions, based on our faith or our nastikatva or astikatva, whatever it is. The binding is only in the sense of karma and karma phala, and not in the sense of Abrahamic commandments. So this is an important distinction. So the function of Shastra is most importantly as a pramana, and then the secondary Shastras, like the commentary traditions, etc., their purpose is to interpret these knowledge that we receive from the basic fundamental Shastras, interpret it and contextualize the teachings to the conditions, the times that we live in. Like we take up a question of technology or genetics today, and we can use the dharmic principle derived from the Dharma Shastras written thousands of years ago, and use the same principles to understand better these challenges that we have today, and kind of moderate them, or kind of come up with a response to them, right?
Yeah, I mean,
yes, and so just one related point. So when it comes to enforcement, again, as Nithin was saying, it was a choice. So there was never the sense of that the state should enforce these rules or restrictions upon anyone. So the merits that would be from an adhyatmic perspective, and there again, there's also prayaschitta. So if something, if a bad act or a negative act is committed, there's a prayaschitta, or a way of penance to ameliorate those effects. And also another practical thing that has happened is if there was something that was said in one of the smritis, that like a guideline to follow, there would be an exception or another way of, if you cannot do that, then do it in this way. So there's a lot of built-in flexibility in the Shastras themselves, which is another point I just wanted to make.
See, I just want to add to the state aspect. See, the Dharma Shastra is divided broadly into three topic wise. One is Acharam, one is Praishchittam, as Aditi said, and other is Vyavaharam. Achara and Praishchitta related to individual actions, right? But Vyavahara is related to law, legal jurisprudence, and the how social societies function. Though no single text was ever considered as a law book in the sense of a constitution that we have today, but the kings, the emperors, and the Dharma Shastra Sabhas, the Mantri Sabhas, the people in these Sabhas, and they were all trained in Dharma Shastras. So they derived the legal principles from these Shastras and then created laws out of them. So there no single text was a law book, but the legal principles in kingdoms were derived from these laws. I mean, the Dharma Shastra, they were all, I mean, for example, Manusmriti itself says that whenever there is a question of dharma, whenever some activity, what is dharma, what is the adharma, or how a punishment is given, this should be discussed. Then a committee of Dharma Shastra scholars have to be, the Veda scholars, the Vaidikas have to be constituted, who will deliberate upon this subject. So this was the way things functioned before. There was no constitution the way we have it today. But Dharma Shastra basically formed the backbone of our social, cultural, and even legal ethos and our worldviews. They formed the backbone, but they were not something which was enforced in the sense of every letter of a particular text is to be enforced by some state authority.
No, I mean, so a few points here. I think number one, we have to recognize that although we talk about Dharma Shastras as a whole, there's a lot of variation between the Shastras on any particular topic we want to talk about. I would almost have to say, to my understanding, and my reading of quite a few of these, sometimes they're diametrically opposed on the same issue across the board, and there's everything in between. So one part of the difficulty is also to recognize that what is the scope of these Dharma Shastras for each one. Like, for example, like if we talk about like my family, right? So I belong to, my Gotra is Shivatsa Gotra. So part of that is, you tell the Giri suit that you follow. So particularly in our family, it's Apastamba. So we follow Apastamba Giri Sutta, which means Manu might not have any relevance to anything I do in my life. And Yajnavalkya might have not any relevance to anything I choose as principles in my life. So again, each, and this, I guess, primarily is because we have to recognize there's three Brahmins on this conversation right here in some ways, talking about, books about that Brahmin men wrote, thousands of years ago. And they were, in some ways excluded a good portion of society, whether it be women or whether it be other communities, from the deliberation about what Dharma is, at least from these texts' perspective. So we have to take that into consideration and think about the fact that, again, this is a particular view about what Dharma is. We also know that there is Desha Dharma, like dharmas that, especially in the commentarial tradition, we have people that wrote this Lagu Prakasha something. There's a few texts where really focuses on regions. Like, for example, in this text, it talks about how in Kerala they have certain practices. In Karnataka have certain practice. Like, for example, they'll talk about Karnataka being able to eat before bathing, and in Kerala, the women, or in Dravida, the women don't cover their breasts, and that's allowed. And in other, so that there is curtailment and control, or customs that apply to each region or each community. And we also have to accept, the diversity of that. So when we talk about these things, we have to look at both the scope of who it applies to, where it applies to, when it applies to, and also the fact that some people were not included in thinking about these topics until recently. So how would you respond to like communities that say, like women, for example, that say, well, these books weren't written with us in mind. They're statements about us. We don't have a say in it. Dalits or Shudras might say, we weren't involved in this writing. We weren't even allowed to read this stuff. Well, how do you respond to that from a Dharma Shastra perspective?
Yeah, let me start with that one. So there are quite a few points there. So the first one is you bring up an important point, which is about the diversity of customs. So the Dharma Shastras are also they're not positivistic in the sense that they observe what are the customs and the behaviors in the prevalent society, and then they organize that into a framework. So they don't come and say, this is the ideal world as it should be, and now let's reconstruct the world according to that. They take the world as it is, as they found it, and then within that, how do you make a dharmic framework out of it? And there has always been a respect for local culture, local traditions, and as part of this Desha Dharma kind of perspective. So there's a story of when Swami Vivekananda, I think, had gone to Nepal, and he was staying at someone's house, and that person actually offered his daughter to spend the night with him. And at first, Swami Vivekananda was appalled, like, what kind of custom is this? But then he realized that was the way that they expressed hospitality. And when he understood it in that context, he was able to, to appreciate what that meant and what was behind that. So that kind of respect for local customs. And again, I think that gets best preserved in this sampradaya or parampara, which can be based on darshana. It can also be based on region and things like that. So that kind of diversity has always been respected, and that must continue to be respected. Now, when it comes to things like women and underrepresented communities, so one thing I would say is, if you look at like our rishis or someone like Veda Vyasa, for example. So I wrote the Curse of Gandhari, and I like to study and read about women in the Mahabharata and the Ramayana and the Puranas. And what's extraordinary is the deep psychological insight that Veda Vyasa Valmiki had into the psychology of women, because when you're at that level, you are in this mode of sarvatma bhava, then no matter what your individual gender, station, society may be, you will be able to have an appreciation for, a care for, and the ability to see what may be the best for others beyond those constraints that apply to you at the physical or psychological level. And the reality is, most of us are not at that level today, and so it is important from a practical perspective today, when we're talking about applying dharma or interpreting dharma, to have that some kind of representation or inclusiveness. So there's this idea of the Talib has on skin in the game, that if you want to opine on something, you should have some stake in it. So it may be very easy for men to say what what women should do. And if those men are not at that level where they have that adhikara to opine on those things, then you do need to more proactively include viewpoints of women or lower caste or other communities. So that's a fair point, that in any modern society, you do have to look at who are going to be the stakeholders in that society and giving them a voice. In the modern context, I think that's a reality. In the ancient context, I think that is very much less of an issue because of the great wise ones we had, who were not bound by the constraints of their individual stations in society, or their genders or other things. And I think you find that because Dharma is not one size fits all, because our rishis did realize that the psyches of women are different from the psyches of men, and therefore the paths of sadhana are also different. And you have just this richness of thought and ability to customize to so many different areas, so many different individual stages of life and things like that, that a lot of that was taken care of in that process. But we've moved away a lot from that today.
Yeah, I want to add to what Aditi has said further. I think your question itself is kind of problematic, because we are superimposing presentism. It's a problem, presentism, what we are assuming today as correct way to imposing it in the past. Because we need to understand, and the society was completely different. See, today society is completely different. In ancient society, for example, each section of the society, there was a clear division of duties, and there is clear division of everything. The way of every community was self-sufficient. Every community had their own duties, had their own lifestyles, had their own customs, and these customs were passed on from generation after generation after generation. So it is by calling, why should the Brahmanas alone work on the Dharma Shastras, is same as saying, why should Vaishyas alone do the business, or why should Kshatriyas alone do the what is called as the manage the administration, or why should Shudras alone manage the service industry. The society was itself organized in that way, and it functioned fairly well in that time. The point is, and it is also not true that there was some kind of superimposition, or somebody, as Aditi was saying, these knowledge about Dharma, they are all revealed by wise ones. Like she said, that the rishis were the wise ones. More importantly, we have evidences from Mahabharata itself. Mahabharata has I think the Puranas, I think which Purana I forgot. It has the famous story of Madalasa. Madalasa was a queen, and it was she who taught her children. She had, I think, 3 or 4 children. They were all princes. She taught both Nivritti Marga and Pravritti Marga to her children. So it was she who was teaching the Dharma to her children. So she was completely knowledgeable in Dharma. So without that knowledge, she could not have taught. That is just one example. We have examples. We see examples of, in Ramayana, you see how Kausalya's conversation with Rama, Sita's conversation with Rama, this completely reveals that it was not that somebody wrote some book from his whims and fancies, and the rest of the society were forced into slavery and to follow. No, it's not like that. See, everybody, the conversations of Sita, conversations of Kausalya, of Madalasa, all this, even Gargi and others, even there are so many conversations of in Mahabharata of female sages, when they were questioned by some men folk, they responded accordingly. Yes, so many examples. So and even in history, we have Mandana Mishra's wife Bharati, who was asked by Shankara to be a judge. How can we say that women were not having a stakehold in this?
We can
There's
say
a point. So the point is, the question, when we keep in this perspective, the reason you may be finding that most of the texts are written by men and not women, it is because the society was structured that way, that different sections, be it based on the varnas or based on ashramas or based on gender, different people were invested in doing different kind of work. For example, Vachaspati Mishra's Bhamati, he could not have written it without the support of his wife Bhamati. He named it after her, right? The point is, if you ask why did Bhamati did not write it herself, it does not arise at all in a society where all sections of society were involved in different kinds of activity, and we have so many poets and poems and kavya which were written by women. So
Sure.
So I think this argument is problematic, and it's an issue of presentism superimposed on past.
Well,
And the second point about Dharma Sutra that you made, I just want to clarify. The Dharma Sutras are considered as main smritis, and the other smritis like Manusmriti, Yajnavalkya are considered as upasmritis, anusmritis, I think. The reason is, for those families, mostly Brahmin families, who have this particular gotra, have this particular shaka, those Dharma Sutras and Grihastha Sutras apply to them. But this importance of Manusmriti, Yagyavalkya Smriti, Parashara Smriti, Narada Smriti lies in the fact they are generic in nature. The very first opening verse of this Manusmriti is the rishis approach Manu and ask him, please tell us about the duties of all the four varnas, as well as those who belong to mixture of varnas. Those who do not belong to any of the four varna, but are born out of mixture of varna. So he is asking Manu to reveal the knowledge about entire society, all the people. It is not about, and here Manu is, who is Manu? He is the Swayambhuva Manu. He is the son of Brahma. So you cannot say that he is some Brahmana sitting based on his whims and fancies, right? So the point I'm making is, this question is kind of misleading when we consider the cultural context, the social context, and overall Shastri context of the issue.
Well, I mean, there's a few points here, right? Number one, I don't think it's an issue of presentism, because I'm not making a moral judgment about whether or not a particular act is good today versus years before. I'm making a general statement that the texts themselves are very focused on a particular group of people from their perspective across the board. Now, whether or not that's right or wrong, that's separate. That's this whole separate point. But it's to say that the texts themselves are focused from Brahmin male's perspective. Generally, there are exceptions, of course there are, but generally from the Brahmin male's perspective, and how they view the world and how they think Dharma should be.
Yeah, I am taking objection to that. That it is not that the source smritis are focused from a Brahmin male's perspective. No, what it is doing is basically the large section of duties and responsibilities given is to the Brahmana community, because their nature, and what are those nature of duties? It is ritualistic nature, because Brahmanas
again, but I'm not disagreeing with any of this.
For the Adhyatma, for the Adhyatma. Yeah, they were given more duties related to rituals, but all others had their own duties, some more, some less. So Brahmanas has highest restrictions, highest duties, because of their function in the society. That's it. And others had less restrictions, and they had their own custom practices, which are not necessarily included. But it is not Brahmana male patriarchal imposition. That is the point I'm making.
I didn't say imposition. I said this is a perspective, right? I mean, I think at some level we've all agreed, we have the understanding that these texts weren't imposed on anyone in terms of like a law or any of that nature. In many ways, the texts tend to be much more descriptive than they are proscriptive. And when they tend to be proscriptive, they tend to be proscriptive towards the Brahmanas that they're talking about. So again, I'm not making a moral claim. I'm not making a claim about what's better or not. What I am saying is that this is just a descriptive nature of what these texts are. Whether or not you believe Manu was original Swayambhu Manu or was a person writing 2,000 years ago, that's another issue, right? And that affects the way you look at the text too, right? Because if you believe it is Swayambhu Manu, then it has some level of divinity, the text itself, that is very sacrosanct. Now, if you see it as being part of a long tradition of people that wrote as if they were Manu for the purposes of covering the periods of time that they were part of, then it appears to be different. So both these perspectives
There is
are.
a third alternative. I have argued in the paper. Hopefully, I will be publishing soon. I had presented it a few years back. The
Sure.
third alternative is that, see, we have to understand how the knowledge is transmitted in our tradition. It is through Guru Shishya Parampara, right?
Yeah.
So when we and there is a tradition of how the texts are transmitted through in the form of an hourglass. First, in the say Manusmriti says the original, in Narada Smriti there is a tradition how this Manu Smriti was transmitted. Originally there were 100,000 verses, but later it was abridged repeatedly into shorter and shorter versions. And finally, the latest version was 4,000 verses or something like that. So what it means is though it has been originally revealed by Manu, it has been transmitted in Guru Shishya tradition for a very, very long time. And it has been again and again recomposed, abridged form. So this is not that somebody wrote in the name of Manu per se. It is more about what Manu had revealed. That knowledge has been written again and again in a shorter and shorter versions. And so it's a kind of the authorial voice is Manu, but the redactors were different people.
Sure.
Anyway, that's a different thing. Let's not go there. It's a slightly.
Yeah, I guess my point again was just about how one approaches the text, depending upon how one has their presuppositions as to what the text is, where it applies, and who's it speaking for. Now, Aditi, you're about to say something. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to say something here. So I think your question is about the kind of the relevance of the Dharma Shastras today in a practical sense. So where I agree, it's important for us to have a knowledge. First of all, we have to decolonize our minds. So right now, the way we think of the Dharma Shastras is very much conditioned based on concepts of Western law and Western history, which are not appropriate. So the first thing that you have to do is you have to understand the Dharma Shastras in the context of their own time and the society as it was then, and understand that. That does not mean that certain things cannot be questioned, and that does not mean that you would literally apply the Dharma Shastras as they were written in that time in today's society. So for example, in a society of that time where women were perhaps had more respect and there were more stable marriages, stable family relationships, there could be certain aspects of Sri Dharma that were more easy to be practiced in a very specific way than they are today. So for example, today women, because of economic realities, because of societal realities, so education of women was always important, and the spiritual stature of women was always recognized much more than in any other place. But in today's context, for example, most women will have to have a career. And I would advise any young woman that they should have their full education, and they should have some ability to support themselves financially, because the family relationships in the society is not as stable as it used to be. Now, having done that, if she chooses that she does not want to work and she wants to be a grihini and have that life as a homemaker, that is wonderful and that is perfectly fine. But the reality is that in today's society, every person should be able to have their financial independence and self-sufficiency, just because that's the society in which we find ourselves today. So I don't think anyone is calling for like a literal application of Manusmriti, and it was as it was written, and things like Niyoga and things like that. But based on that, what you do get is you get a certain worldview, you get an ethos of how Dharma was practiced, and different principles and values And the hard work, which we have not been able to do today, is how to apply that in a practical sense in the world in which we find ourselves today. So how do you practice a varnashrama dharma today when you're not in a society where you're going to force people into certain professions? That's not realistic, nor do we want to go to that state. So how do you apply those principles and values in a way that makes sense today? And that is a very difficult thing to do, and you have to have the proper adhikara for that, and you have to be someone who can understand the karmic consequences, not just at an individual level, but at a societal level, and things like that. And we find ourselves in a position, unfortunately, where we spend so much time looking backward and trying to dissect that rather than looking forward. And so I think you don't have to say that the way society existed then is what we have to recreate now, but you have to understand how dharma operated as a framework to make that society balanced and holistic, and on the whole, much, much better than any other societies we found at that time in its treatment of people, in overall well-being. And so therefore, how do you use those principles and those building blocks today? And it will look different, society will look different, but we have to find that foundation of dharma for today's reality. And I think that's a lot of times people mistake that in this exercise, we want to go back to society 3,000, 5,000 years ago, which is impossible.
Sure.
Yes,
Great
I
points.
think Aditi had made a very important point, and she's absolutely correct. I just add a few things. Uh, as I see, there are two extreme kind of approaches to Dharma Shastra. One is the study of these texts as a museum artifact, as something which existed in the past, as something which was relevant only in the past. So, this is mostly the approach of modern scholarship to our Shastras. That this is something which happened in the past. It was all Desha Kala something. Now it is no longer relevant. We have moved on. This is one aspect. The other is, of course, the very literal reading of the text and dreaming about recreating the past as it was in the same shape. I think both are incorrect approach. Both are the former is deeply problematic, and it is deeply problematic in many levels, and the latter is simply impractical. The correct way to understand, approach Dharma Shastra, and this is approach with our text itself gives to us. Actually, it is not something we make up. If we spend some time with our Shastras, this is the vision it gives. That the root understanding must be based in the fact that Shastras are pramana. That is, they give those principles, they give the knowledge, makes us aware of those dharmic principles which are perpetually valid. That is, ahimsa paramo dharma, Mahabharata says, and other text says. Suddenly today, himsa does not become paradharma, right? But the contextual application of ahimsa changes. For example, in Gita, Bhagavan says that Arjuna has to do Kshatriya Dharma and fight the war. So the context changes. The point is, we study the Shastras reveal the fundamental perpetual principles. They also make certain comments about, descriptive comments about, in the sense of how certain principles could be applied to social issues. We need to differentiate these foundational principles, the first principles as I call it, from these descriptive comments. And these foundation principles are perpetual, because Shastra is pramana. That it says you do one karma, it says you do this yajna, this, I'm just giving this example again and again, you get swarga. Suddenly today we cannot say, like we have these issues in India that we should stop Pashubali in some temples. The Pashubali is in tantric text. The Shastra says that you do Pashubali, you attain this goal. You suddenly cannot say that we will not do this and we'll do something else because of secular reason or our animal rights reason, and then what attain the same result. That is not possible. Understanding this, understanding the role of Shastra as a pramana, then you contextualize these teachings to our times. So when I am speaking of a dharmic civilization or a dharmic society, building a dharmic society today. It is not building a society as it was 2000 years back. We do not know how it was. For God's sake, we do not know. We have only glimpses of it. What we should do instead is derive principles, as Aditi said, from our Shastras, because they are the source of knowledge. They tell us what is Dharma, what is not Dharma. From that principles, we contextualize it. One very simple example is, I wrote a series of articles on abortion issue. Today, the abortion issue, the debate is completely from a Western perspective. The pro-choice, the pro-life, these are main groups in the West, and similar groups are being formed in India as well.
Sure.
Why should we need to copy paste the West? Why cannot we have an Indic perspective on abortion that could transcend this pro-life and pro-choice positions?
Absolutely.
So this is what when I envision the work of our people, when I envision my work with Dharma Shastra, this is the work I envision for myself, to interpret, to contextualize. Contextualize is a word I prefer, because where the principles are perpetual, they are eternal, they are always valid. They will be valid 2000, 10,000, 200,000 years later as well.
Sure.
But the application part is contextual. It depends upon yuga, kala, dharma. Aditi ji spoke about niyoga. Our Shastra themselves says that Kali Yuga, niyoga cannot be practiced. It should not be practiced. It does not mean that niyoga has become a adharmic practice. No, it simply means that we people do not
avoid
have
it.
the indriya
Yeah.
nigraha. We are not competent to practice it. So it is prohibited for us. That is the simple thing. So, and we have a text like Parashara Smriti, which was specifically written which was given by Parashara Maharshi for the sake of Kali Yuga. We can further contextualize. He has already given one level of contextualization. We can further contextualize it for our times. We do not need to write a new smriti. We do not need to modify our existing smritis. That is a papam. That is a great apachara if we do it. But we can contextualize and interpret it our times. One good example is Parashara, what Manu does not say, but Parashara says is, he gives 5 situations wherein a woman can remarry. In the case of a death of a husband, in the case of he is important, and some other thing that if he is a completely adharmic person. So this is a situation, in today's situation, wherein no men or women are perfect. It is this is the argument that Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar used to argue for widow remarriage. Right? So this is how Dharma Shastra has to be interpreted and reinterpreted and contextualized. And this is the template that even Mahabharata says. In Mahabharata, there is an episode of when I think it was Vishwamitra, there was a deep drought and there was nothing to eat.
He went to the Chandala.
Yes, he saw the dogs and he wanted to eat it. But the Chandala says this is against Brahmana Dharma. You see, even Chandala knows what is a Brahmana Dharma, what is a Chandala Dharma. That is, the education about Dharma was there in the entire society. It was not that only one community was there. But the point is, then the Vishwamitra said that no, this is Apad Dharma. I have to eat for survive. If I survive today, then I can do Prayashchitta or anything else. But if I don't survive today, then it is adharma. Not trying to survive is adharma. So we have to interpret and reinterpret it today. In fact, I say that Hindu society today is living in a apad dharma condition for the last 1200 years, because we have been invaded, we have been colonized, and we are still living under, say, Nehruvian secularism and attacks by other forces, but we are living in a apad dharma situation. So we need to think in this perspective as well when we speak of today.
Okay. Aditi, any response?
Yeah, no, I very much agree with that, and it's interesting because we're also going through in the U.S. The Supreme Court vacancy and things like that. And one thing that comes to mind is there's a big debate in the U.S. on how to interpret our Constitution. So there's kind of there are two very extreme views, which kind of reminds me of the way that Nithin was describing it. So one is the conservative view, which is an originalist view or a textualist view. And that means you go back to the Constitution as it was written a few hundred years ago, and you interpret it very, very literally, as it was intended in the minds of the founding fathers at that time. And actually, but that actually, even though they say they want to do that, that actually doesn't work, because first of all, it's very hard to know exactly how things were then, what was in their mind, and things like that. And it becomes an excuse for all sorts of things. So for example, the Second Amendment was about the right for militias to form. But now it's about like rights to carry guns to stores. And then the other is something that the Constitution is there, but it's just very loose. And the more liberal perspective is, you're not necessarily being bound by the constraints of the Constitution because of the world in which we are today. And so it's very interesting to me, because you see the richness of, we know how the knowledge of how to interpret text is so much richer in our tradition, where we're not bound by either of these kind of silly extremes, as Nithin was saying. It's not just a museum artifact, nor is it literal, but we have like a flexible yet grounded, authentic way of interpreting texts and contextualizing them through our tradition. And I think just in the simple example, you can see how much richer our tradition is in knowing how to interpret text. So like the rules of Mimamsa, the rules of Nyaya. So the Dharma Shastras, as we've been saying, there's so many different sutras, but none of them will come out and say, oh, this sutra was wrong, or that's all, or I contradict this. They always find samanvaya, and they always link themselves back to the other Dharma Shastras, or to the other Shastras. And so you have this continuity of tradition, where there's no break from tradition, and yet you're able to continually evolve and not be stagnant, which is the way that the Dharma is. And I think this should give us a much greater appreciation for the richness of our own tradition.
So this is the interesting point, right? Like when Nithin said that we shouldn't create new Dharma Shastras or texts or append them, and that's apacharam. I think in many ways that's what the commentarial tradition is all about within these texts, right? Is a way to append without destroying what was said before. It was reinterpreted.
We can always create independent texts like Sri Dharma Paddhati, etc. But they are not smritis. We don't need to modify the smritis.
Yeah. I mean, like when we do commentaries on it, there, in some sense, that is the modification of being done without actually doing the modification of the text itself, right? Like if you look at a lot of the times, the whole concept of a Purva Paksha that's really done is done for the commentator that came before and that commentated in a certain way. You're going after their particular viewpoint, and then you pull in Shastras to support your viewpoint. So I mean, I think sometimes, and this is where I think the crux of a lot of this comes down to, is from a legal perspective, as you brought in, Aditi, is how do we do our textual exegesis? How do we look at our textual hermeneutics? How do we show relationship between these texts? And I think in that sense, we have an incredibly rich tradition. But the problem that we have in this day and age, and we'll get to the modernity really in the next few minutes, is that we tend to view these texts as they are in isolation from anything else. They're kind of like they're, each of them themselves are a Bible, or they themselves are a way to interpret the entire framework of Hinduism, or Hindu society, right? Like people's hate on Manu Dharma Shastra or Manusmriti is from the perspective that they believe somehow, somewhere, sometime, people practice these ideas, as opposed to saying this is someone's thought process that was applied throughout time in different ways by different people in different understandings, right? It's a very different understanding of what these texts are. So any comments on that? If not, then we can jump to our next big point, which will be, let's talk about modernity now. We spent quite a bit of time talking about the Shastras. Let's talk about, things like how do the Dharma Shastras apply to things like technology or corporations or climate change? Is there a place for them? I mean, in some ways, some of these texts don't deal with this, but what are the concepts that could be applied and give us kind of a framework to address these issues in our time?
Sorry, I lost you.
Oh, did you lose me too, Aditi? Did you hear what I said?
Yeah, I missed the last part of what you just said.
Oh, I just said, since in the modern time, I mean, what are the, these Shastric principles, dharmic principles that we can bring to the table for things like climate change, for corporate interaction, for businesses? How, what today can Dharma do for these issues that we find ourselves facing?
I think see one of the very important aspect about dharma is that it speaks about this what I previously said about samanya dharma, the very basic principles. So these are very first principles, and they can be applied in all the fields of life. Say, take corporate for example. See, in corporates, each and every day we have this human interactions. The human interactions today and human interactions in 2000 years back. I mean, the modes of interaction could have changed, but the human nature has not changed. We were subjected to Arishadvarga, the Kama, Krodha, Lobha, Moha. Then
Yeah.
we are subjected to this today also. So all our ethics, when you speak about corporate ethics or medical ethics, what are some of the medical issues that we face today? I'm just giving generic examples. We have this, say for example, crimes that related to some doctors involved in, some people involved in, the organ trafficking, right? So that is clearly something we can easily understand from our framework. But of course, not all issues are so easy. For example, issue of abortion, especially for medical reasons. We have this, my friend, Dr. Pingali Gopal, recently wrote a piece on, how Down syndrome, the people with Down syndrome. Now, the medical technology has so advanced that certain genetic tests when the woman is pregnant can be made, which indicates that the child could be having Down syndrome, and they advise the many parents go for abortion in such cases. So the question is, how dharmic is such an abortion? Is it ethical, it is not ethical, or it is somewhere in between, or does it have a ethical component as well as unethical component? And these are the issues that can definitely be examined by our texts, by using our frameworks of what our Dharma Shastra says on these issues. And technology is another aspect. I mean, I think the greatest disruptor in the last few centuries is the technology, and this technology is so much changing on a daily basis, right? So we are facing newer and newer challenges to negotiate with this. It may be climate change, it may be grooming of children through online. This is a great social issue. This is a criminal issue basically. So the technology is giving rise to all these issues. So I think we have a great material, and even a simple question of organ donation, whether one should donate organ after death, it is a dharmic issue. All the issues that are related to society can be understood using dharmic frameworks. We may or may not have specific guidelines in our dharma shastras related to these new things happening, but we have the first principles, we have the general principles using which we can arrive at frameworks to analyze them. We can arrive at the indic drishti, so to speak, to understand, to negotiate with these changing times.
Sure. Aditi?
Yeah, so I think one of the great tragedies is because of colonialism, we've destroyed traditional learning and traditional institutions where we don't have really scholars of the Hindu Dharma Shastras. So like about 10 years ago, there's Professor Werner Mensky at Oxford. He's one of the modern scholars of Hindu law. And he was saying there's no one left. And I mean, he's a Western scholar, but after he goes, there's no one left who's actually making a systemic study of the Dharma Shastras, who's reading P.V. text and doing it from the standpoint of, Nyaya, Mimamsa, and having like a very deep rooted understanding. So when you don't have that body of scholars, of panditas, and also our acharyas are not addressing these issues, and you have this huge vacuum. And there are two dangers. One is that you let the voices based in Western thought dominate, or you have people give very off-the-cuff answers which are not properly rooted in Dharma. And so the long-term answer is that, first of all, we have to reestablish ourselves in Dharma. We have to make the space to provide for scholars, for not just scholars, but true panditas in the great sense of the word, who are devoted to the study of Shastra and who don't have to worry about making a living. Because as soon as you have to worry about making a living off of it, you can't have that purity of mind to take a very objective, impartial view. So they have to be provided for, there have to be institutions that develop this. So then you can have this thinking, and not only do they need to be rooted in Dharma, but they have to understand the Western frameworks. They have to understand these questions of technology, what's actually happening in AI, what are these social issues, what are the other perspectives, so you can have like a meaningful dialogue and things like that. And then we also need our acharyas who are like supposed to be Jagat gurus to take up these issues, because these are like the critical issues. This is what's happening, and we can't not be at the table. So we have to have that. And I think what's important for each of us to do in our own way is to make a study of the Shastras, the Dharma Shastras, not to get very trapped in arcane questions, but get the worldview, get the ethos, get the principles and the interpretative frameworks, so that we can think about these things more meaningfully. And it's very difficult. Like I myself don't like to get pinned down on certain positions, because these things have long-term consequences, and it's very easy if you're you're at a conference, or if you get asked a question, you just want to give an answer that this is what Dharma says, and it's a big trap, because these things have long-term consequences. There are many karmic subtleties to it, and you really do have to be a person of the adhikara and the far sight to be able to do these things, which is why you don't really have new smritis, because it's not that it's impossible to write a new smriti, but it's just you have to have the adhikara that what you say is binding, not just on society today, but 100 years from now, a few hundred years from now. And that's not an easy thing to do. At the same time, we can't abstain when the battle is being fought and you have this civilizational war that's raging. You can't just sit on the sidelines either. So in our own lives, we have to make the causes and conditions and root ourselves in Dharma, encourage others to do so, and make attempts with sincerity and humility to think about these questions. But there is scope for that. So I think Nithin mentioned some things. Like I think R. Vaidyanathan did an excellent job on caste as social capital. So, looking at some of these traditional organization of society, what were some of the benefits of it? And can you leverage those things from like a social capital or social security perspective based on those concepts in the modern world? There's a lot on leadership studies. So there was so many different, for women leadership, there's no richer source of that than Hindu Dharma. in some of the role models we have in the Puranas and the Itihas and in history, and then different styles of leadership, things like that. There's a lot that we could do. So China has done a very good job of this, looking at its traditions and things like that. And their texts are actually used in Harvard Business School, like the art of war and things like that. So there's definitely scope for that. And we have to, first of all, not have an inferiority complex. We have to have confidence in our Shastras and our traditions of knowledge and say, yes, they have answers, they have relevance today. We have to study them first, and then we have to promote them and things like that. So I think so that's kind of the bigger framework that I would encourage.
So, I want to add a few things to
Sure.
what Aditi said. I think it is not correct to say that we do not have a Dharma Shastra scholars. See, I, for one, am studying under one such Dharma Shastra scholar in Mysore itself. I'm studying Manusmriti under him. And we have the Sanskrit Pathshala, which was started by Maharaja, long back. But there are no students to study. That is the problem. So it is not that scholars are not there, but students are not willing to study. See, today we have someone like Sri Mani Dravida Shastrigal, who is he's not only one of the great authority on Advaita Vedanta, but also on Mimamsa. So there are scholars. I am reading some books in Kannada and some Telugu. The scholars associated with Tirupati Tirumala and associated with Sringeri. They are all scholars of Mimamsa and Dharma Shastra. I think the problem is when what the British did was they systematically dismantled the Dharma Shastra tradition. So now the scholars we have are very few and divided. They are there, yes, but few and divided. But more importantly, they do not have patronage of the society. They do not have patronage of the state. They only have patronage of some matas and peethams. Therefore, they keep themselves to themselves. So the society no longer wants to know what these scholars are doing, because they are no longer concerned about living a dharmic life. Hindu society wants to enjoy a good life. They want their kids to do IAS or do software engineering, fly to US, or have a marriage. So they are not concerned about dharma at all. There was a time when people were concerned about dharma. One good example is Trayambaka Yajwan wrote Sri Dharma Paddhati, I think 3 centuries back, but he was commissioned to write that work. He was commissioned by one of the queens of that Tanjore, I think, if I'm not mistaken, to write that work, because they wanted to know what is the dharma and they wanted to live by it. But today there are no patronage. And much of the scholars are in scholarship is in Sanskrit, and as a society we have been colonized, and English as a language is the mainstay. Even when we speak in vernacular, Indian languages, I don't like the term vernacular, Indian languages, even then English is the mainstay as far as academic and knowledge is concerned. So the scholars of Dharma Shastra in English language, like Dr. Bharat Gupt, are very less, who have exposure to Western systems as well as Indian Shastric tradition. They are less. Very true. But the Shastra scholars themselves, they exist. It is possible to revive this tradition. And Aditi makes very important point. This is the need of the time to revive this tradition. And now we, for a temporary basis, we need to bridge this gap somehow by, we need Dharma Shastra scholars in English who have some kind of Shastric grounding and also can articulate well in English, at least till a time when India as a society move from this English, we are also communicating in English, right?
Right.
So from an English-based communication, English-based knowledge system to a Sanskrit-based or Indian language-based knowledge system. So unless that transition happens, unfortunately, it was not done when independence happened. That was the right time to do. We have to create literature, create scholarship in English, which is completely Shastric in nature. We have scholars now here and there, but that needs to be created as a whole. For that, we need a social patronage, we need a state patronage, and see, well, for example, when the government, for example, now there is an issue in India, about increasing the age of marriage of the of girls. That is, the Modi government is currently deliberating upon the topic. And do they have any Dharma Shastra scholar in the community, in the committee that is deliberating? I don't think so. To my knowledge, it is not there. If I'm mistaken, I'm happy to be corrected. But all the people
Because
who
it's
are
secular, right? That's why.
yes, all the people who are there are either, I think, from a medical background or from a administrative, backgrounds. So we ourselves are not interested in finding a Indic view or a Dharma Shastric view of any issues. So what would these poor scholars will do? They keep their knowledge, they study for the love of the Vidya, and they have written books. There are books. I have a very big volume book on Samskara Mahodhadi. Where, it's a wonderful book. It's in Kannada. It has been published in Kannada, wherein it gives a very detail about all the 16 samskaras. But how many people read that book, right? The point. So there is no patronage. There are no people are not interested. So this is the effect of colonization was formal structures were mostly dismantled, and the people were brainwashed. We have been colonized into rejecting our traditional systems as and our own people. This reformist attitude is in our own people, wherein traditional systems were rejected, traditional practices were rejected as superstitions, as outdated, as regressive, and we have completely copy and pasted without deliberation all the so-called modern values, modern systems. I'm not saying they are all bad. I'm just saying that we have done so without any deliberation.
Yeah, and the real tragedy of this is, so right now there's a lot of work on, and I've written some papers on this, on international law and how it's obviously based very narrowly on Western concepts of law. And there is this growing recognition and acknowledgement of that, and that we should have like other systems of law and what they would look like. So for example, Islamic law, there's a lot of study on how to apply Islamic law in a progressive way, or for international law, or things like that. You have things like Sharia forms of banking and all this other things. So everyone else is contributing to this discourse. And we haven't even, like you said, we have no interest in even looking at our own Shastras. So, and some people may say, well, maybe we don't need it or it's superfluous. But you can't even make that judgment if you don't even know what is there in the Dharma Shastras. So at least let's find out what is there. Let's bring it out. And then you see, like, you can just think of in the Mahabharata, there's so much about the conduct of war, the ethics of war, how single combat should be handled, that the civilians should not be hurt, that animals should not be hurt. There's so many things there that are much more humane, much more compassionate than the Geneva standards and things like that. But we're not even having those discussions while other communities are. And when there is this thirst to just de-Westernize systems of law, that we have to be part of that discussion, especially as we're probably the last extant like Chatonic or indigenous tradition that's alive in this world on a mass scale. So we have that duty, not just for ourselves, but also just from the context of Loka Sangraha, for the well-being of the world, for preserving diversity of traditions and cultures, and all of that. So it's very necessary.
Yeah, that's kind of the one of the at least starting points of this conversation is to start these dialogues about how we can bring Dharma Shastras back into, and I hate to say back into relevance, because for some people they are relevant in a much more visceral way. But yeah, I tend to agree with so much of what you're saying in terms of the lack of people's even care to read any of this stuff. Like, and this it's a little it's a little sad. It's a little sad, especially when people can go look up, Plato's The Republic, but people won't pick up, Anushasan Parva or Shanti Parva or Manu or Yajnavalkya, who have an entire tradition of ethics, of political philosophy, of whatever it is, right? That has a very different viewpoint of how to approach the world that we live in. And in many ways, despite some of the issues we might find, we understand, at least in a dharmic sense, that there are some pure values that underline these things, like ahimsa, akrodo, like these sarvabhuta hite, sarvabhuta hite, right? Like for the purpose of all beings, compassion, daya, that undergird so much of what we consider to be dharma, that I feel like we're doing ourselves a great disservice by ignoring it. And Nithin, you're right. And I've had conversations with a lot of professors about how much great scholarship there is in Indian languages like Kannada, Telugu, or Tamil, or even like Hindi, but people just don't have access to. And these scholars are, in many ways, are PhD level like geniuses who have no exposure in the Western world, have no exposure to any other Hindus out there, because people don't see them that way. They see them as being this, and uh, antiquated kind of a parochial people that sit in a corner just talking about like pointless things, as opposed to deep thinkers. I mean, the Mimamsa tradition is still alive and well, and Nyaya is still alive and well, and Dharma traditions are still alive and well in terms of thinking about it. And maybe in some sense, what the goal should be is to find, do more work and more conversations on particular topics. How, maybe have a conversation about like what technology means in the dharmic world. What does it mean to have AI? What does it mean to have, like you said, online social media companies, running, the way we think about the world, or how we engage with elections, or how we engage with, businesses. What duties do businesses have to society? Is it only shareholder value? Is it only for growth of art? Does the dharma of artha apply to businesses, or does it not, because it's a legal fiction? I mean, these are such important questions that can change the way we think about corporate entities, and or even the world we live in. Yeah. Sorry.
Even a very simple example is like, for Vaishyas or for wealthy business people or kings, they had a duty to do public works. So
Yeah.
all the Shastras talk about it, like, it may have been like digging wells or providing for that. But the idea is, if you have wealth, you have to share it for the good of society and invest in the public good.
So I mean, here's a clear example. Like you said, you have to give works, but should you get a tax benefit for this, right? What are these things? This is what I'm saying is, if it's done, if it's danam, you're giving it as a gift, as I mean, I know it's a gift. It's not a charity in the same way the Western world sees charity, right? So is it something that we should give you a tax break on? Should you get something in return for giving a gift? A gift is given freely with nothing in expectation in return. I mean, these are the questions that are very fascinating to me. Like, 'cause I think it's Dharma says, in my view, that you shouldn't get anything for it. That you should be giving it because this is your duty, right? To give. I mean, again, we can even talk about it now, but
I'm a tax lawyer, so I may have a different conflict of interest.
Another example is China is investing a lot of resources to study its the medieval wars,
Sure.
the geopolitics and the theories, the worldview, and all its whole current geopolitical worldview, its approaches, its methodology. It's derived from its own study of its past.
Yeah.
But India has such a rich tradition. Yes, there are scholars who have studied Kautilya, there are scholars who have studied them, but as a whole, are we using these principles in our I do not see it. I mean, I see we are still, our highest leadership in India, they're still stuck with Gandhi and Ahimsa, and they don't seem to move beyond that.
So interesting point, Nithin, which is really crazy to me, is Kautilya talks about the government's having free, opening up regulations for for houses of prostitution and for houses of alcohol and regulated, protecting the women, right? What has the government of India done? They've outlawed it and treat these women like they're something terrible, right? Like as if they don't exist. So part of the Cotilian idea of Dharma was that the government has, the king has a duty to ensure the happiness and protection of his praja. What has the government done in that sense? They've employed the same stupid British laws and the same stupid mentality of the British that when they, 200 years ago, they're still in place. And these are the things that we don't even talk about.
And worse, we are made to believe by our education system that India never invaded a country. We were always peace-loving, ahimsa-vadis.
No, I mean, we know that's not true. We know the Cholas went down to Southeast Asia.
Yes,
Know,
yes. See, you don't study them. See, you hardly study them. You only study how India was invaded again and again, and how we are cowards who were defeated, who got defeated again and again. And we don't even much study about the mighty Vijayanagara Empire or the Marathas. Except for very few things here and there, you don't study it. So this is the mentality today we have developed, that war is bad by itself. India should not have a geopolitical ambitions. See, I am currently writing few articles on this in Daily Guardian, wherein I am arguing that India should embrace dharmic expansionism as a geopolitical goal. And I'm using Indic concepts like Chakravarti, the concepts of Vijigishu, and the mandala theory of Kautilya. So these are the Indic concepts. We have these concepts. We have the notion of the Rajasuya Yagya. These are all concepts which are very geopolitical in nature.
Although if we have Ashwamedha, it'll be a very slow expansion these days.
There's zero expansion these days.
The difference
we are losing. We are losing for the last 2,200 years. We are losing everything. We are not gaining anything.
The difference is when we expanded into different territories, we didn't rape, loot, and plunder, and we preserved the local culture, the local traditions. So it was it's done in a dharmic way.
So I mean, but these are the things I feel like we have to be taking up, is how do we engage with these concepts that we're dealing with today? Like how can a one country deal with another country? Like again, like you said, mandala theory can apply, although it might not be the same now. Again, we might have to reinterpret it for this age because of plane travel and air travel and friendship across seas, and it's different, right? So we have to take the principles and apply it, but there's still elements there. I mean, and this is what always sits with me, is the nature of even Dharma as how we should think about it. As, for example, you and me, Aditi, we live entirely outside the world of India, where we don't have access to the sacred geography, the sacred landscapes, the access to purohitas, the same way we would, if we were in India, or access to anything like that. Where we have a very different experience of what Dharma is in this context, right? What does it mean to be Dharmic in America? It might be very different than it means to be Dharmic in India. And part of that is we have to figure that out. And like for people like us and across the world that don't live in India with that aspect.
Yeah, I want to give one example on that. Actually, I want to just close out one point on. So the Kautilya, the Arthashastra also says that a contented king comes to ruin.
Yeah.
So if you're in leadership, you shouldn't be content with what you have.
No.
So you need like rajas in a positive way, and then things like that. So what kind of characteristics should you have in the leader of the country and things like that? So it's interesting when you talk about like dharma in different societies. So even a very simple thing, like growing up in America, I would always see my friends, they would go to church. It was a very congregational affair. And then when I was in college, they would have chaplains that they could go to for counseling. And this to me, like when you're in that society, then you want that. So the function of the temple in the US is and will be and should be different from how it may be traditionally in India. You need that. So now you have more of these like Sunday school classes and things like that. But that congregational aspect, that sense of community, that kind of thing is very important in the American context, and that's not inconsistent with Dharma. So you can evolve that. And also this need for what I'd call like Hindu counseling or Hindu chaplaincy, especially when you're in college, which is a very sensitive and vulnerable time in people's lives. It's when you're formulating your identity and things like that. The universities have like, you know, funded not just like a rabbi or like a chaplain for different faiths, but they also have like institutions of you know, like Jewish centers or Christian centers that are there just for the students, and they're very active. And so at that time, when a person is forming their identity in their late teens, early 20s, they have this religious background with them. And when you don't have that from the Hindu perspective, you're missing out on a very key period in a person's life. And then they don't ever have that sense of Hindu identity, and you miss out on entire generations. And so when you think about the America or the West, you have to keep these things in mind. What are the resources that other communities have, and how do we develop and provide them for our own community?
Absolutely. I mean, that's a very, very good point about the colleges. And I remember, I don't know if you were involved, but I was part of HSC in college, but it's such a standalone entity, right? There wasn't any other support. I think some schools have started doing this. For example, Georgetown has Brahmachari Sharan as part of the Hindu chaplain there. I think it's very helpful for the Hindu community there. But I think USC has Varun Soni, and there's very few places across the US that give any voice to the Hindu community to engage with, right? I mean, again, this is part of the issue is the nature of the Purohita in Hindu context is very different from the nature of a pastor or a priest or father in the Christian context, or imam in the Muslim context. Like this is in some sense it's very transactional, right? You come in, they're there to do your samskaras for you. You don't go to them for your life questions. You don't go to them for advice. So maybe some people do for the purposes of what should I do? I'm going through something hard, and then they give a mantra or something of that nature. But there's, in some ways, it's not that like, I don't know, like a pastoral
relationship.
Like,
pastoral relationship.
Yeah. So it's something that the community needs, because I mean, part of the need is we can't go ask Shankaracharya in Kanchi or Sringeri about advice in life, or I don't know, whoever else, but it's something that we have to figure out how to deal with that.
Yeah, and I have been part of HSC, and they do wonderful work, but they face so many obstacles. I know when I was trying to start an HSC chapter in my own college, there's so much political opposition, there's so many roadblocks, so many challenges that they face. And the other thing is, you're right that there is this kind of starting to be this idea of Hindu chaplaincy and things like that. And then again, we come back to the question of how to equip people so that they're well versed in the tradition and that they're able to function well in these in these roles, and making sure they're rooted in Dharma and things like that.
Yeah, and we don't have a leader within at least the U.S. side, or leaders of Hindu Americans who are steeped in Dharma or tradition or any of this. There's a few, but they're not really prominent, right?
You rarely have leaders like that in India.
Well, that's true too. I know. I mean, we're coming on to like a 2-hour mark, so I think here we can kind of start wrapping up. Like, what are your final thoughts? We covered quite a bit here, and I would love to have another podcast where we can talk more about like specific topics, because I think that's and actually get into the nitty gritty of getting through arguments and talking about how, for example, like to have a conversation on the abortion argument from a Dharmic perspective, or arguments on, a corporate responsibility or climate change and how we should approach it would be great. Because I think that's the kind of stuff that the community would be more and more interested in hearing from. What does Dharma have to say about this? How do we approach it? It's so unique. Science has a role, but again, science doesn't give you values. It gives you facts. Like they give you facts, and how do these facts apply in a Dharmic sense to how we should approach, because our tradition also is very much concerned with the fact that every action we do has a consequence, right? We're not, there's no purely good action, there's no purely evil action. There's just a lot of grays. And how do we manage that? How do we negotiate that? So I do think like these kind of conversations are so important. And I want to do more of these. So, any thoughts you guys have to close off on?
My final comments are that our topic today is Dharma and modernity, and I think if it is asked, is Dharma relevant today to us today? Then I would say it is perhaps more relevant today than it has been in the past, because in the past we were more rooted, we were more into Dharma in our day-to-day life, so it was kind of taken for granted, and we did not even notice its existence per se. But today, since we have become so alienated from our own traditions, from our own knowledge systems, from our own worldviews, so we no longer even think in our own terms. We think in the frameworks that we have derived from the West. So at this time, I think a revival of Dharma in our discourse, in our narratives on various socio-political, cultural issues is the need of the hour. It is very much important that if my request to all the people who are working to revive this Indic drishti, who are interested in this Indic perspective, to not ignore this very important aspect of our Indian knowledge tradition, which is the Dharma Shastras, because they are the, I see people speak about ethics, speak about practice, day-to-day living, but they do not take into consideration the Dharma Shastra at all. I mean, they royally ignore it as a genre of literature as a whole. So this is something we need to rectify. We need to engage with our smritis, our Dharma Shastras. We don't need to take everything written there as it is. See, all of us have different approaches to this. For some may approach from a perspective of Shraddha, and in the sense of these texts as completely as a pramanatva. Some may approach literally, some may approach in a more skeptical sense. That is all fine, but we need to engage with them.
Yeah.
I think today there is a trend that is going in hashtag going in Twitter, reject Manu. That is the hashtag that is trending on Twitter. I just came to know that, wherein they are again speaking about burning the Manusmriti. I think these thought process are not going to help anybody, not much less we as a nation. It will not help us to reclaim our Hindu civilization, reclaim our Indian identity. So we need to engage with our Shastras, any text, it may be Mahabharata, Ramayana, Dharma Shastras, Smritis, whatever it is, we need to engage with them. We need to derive principles. We need to make use of them in our day-to-day life. As Bhagavan Krishna says in Gita, even a little bit of practice of dharma will free us from great fear. So we need to keep this in mind, that this is a statement of Bhagavan himself. So we need to make attempts to understand dharma, howsoever little it is possible for us, it is relevant for us. Not everybody needs to be a scholar of Dharma Shastra, but we all need to study, become familiar. So we have completely lost the system of storytelling from grandmothers to children, which were mostly based on itihasa, Puranas, etc. What we have today is English rhymes. Mary had a little lamb, twinkle, twinkle, little star. See, my daughter is now almost 6 months, and I was thinking, what shall I teach her? What kind of rhymes? And I discovered there is a wonderful YouTube channel wherein the same tune, perhaps even some of the similar songs, but the same tune, they have completely Sanskritized it. The rhymes are in Sanskrit, but the tune is same. The tune is same, that Mary had a little lamb, or twinkle twinkle little star, but the words are in Sanskrit. So I think we need to come up with more innovative solutions like that. We are living in modernity, so we need to contextualize dharma to modernity, but let us not cut the roots. Let us not try to fly by cutting our wings. Our civilization is our wings. It is our roots. It is what gives us identity. Let us not separate ourselves from our ancestors, our rishis. Let us not um, let us not ignore our rishi runa and pitru runa and devata runa that we have, that the debts that we have from the very birth into uh, this very beautiful civilization. So let us understand our and let us understand our own roles in society. Let us do our bit for dharma. This is my final comment.
Aditi?
Thank you.
So I would say we're probably living in a more of a postmodern world than a modern world. And at this time, there are a lot of like existential kind of questions coming up around, like culture, what is history, even something like history, how do we define ourselves, what is our identity? So you're seeing a lot of this kind of crisis in the West, in the US today. In the US, there's even like a constitutional crisis of like, how do we think of our constitution and things like that. And in that context, there is this need, I think, for alternative frameworks. And one of them is the dharmic framework. And if you really believe in dharma, and if you have shraddha in dharma, then it's not just something that is a value for yourself. It is a value for society and something we should be serious about reviving or propagating, not just for ourselves, but for the overall good. So this is part of our dharma, is to understand dharma. And I think nowadays there are a lot of spiritual movements coming about that are focused on sadhana or meditation or this and that. But you can't do that in isolation without it being grounded in the framework of dharma. So if you just do japa and meditation, for most people that's not enough. And that's not enough for the overall loka sangraha. So there is a need and a big vacuum when it comes to understanding and talking about dharma. And so there is that need there, and so therefore we have to become conversant with the Shastras, with the framework, and all the other things we've been talking about. The other thing I'd want to say is something like the Dharma Shastras there's a lot of subtlety when it comes to dharma, and there's a lot of sensitivity when it comes to the Dharma Shastras. And it's very important when we have these discussions to be what I call like aptakama, by which I mean you shouldn't have like an ulterior motive. It needs to be depoliticized. It shouldn't be about what is going to be most pleasing or what will get me votes or what will sound good or what's a good Twitter hashtag, but what is dharma? And it's very important when we have these discussions to have it in a space where it's depoliticized and everyone is focused really with a sincere intent of discovering dharma for the sake of loka sangraha, and to keep politics out of it, which is why, as we've been talking about, patronage was so important for our scholars and our pandits, so we have this freedom of thought. So I think that is important. And I think we need to have confidence. I think we need to at least start with the acknowledgement that the Western model, which does have important contributions, important benefits, but it's rooted in the past few hundred years of history of a very small corner of the world. And no one could logically think that that little model has all the answers for all time. And the sad thing is most of the indigenous traditions, systems of knowledge have been lost, and we're left with very few. And it is our duty on behalf of those indigenous systems, of which Hinduism is one, to really delve into the depths of that and bring that out. And I would hope that in the process of doing that, we also help other societies, other countries go back to their own past and their own roots and their traditions and rediscover that for themselves. So there's a need here, there's an opportunity here, and we have to make the most of that. So there are things we as individuals can do to root ourselves in sadhana and dharma, and things we need to think about at an institutional or broader societal level. And it's really important to focus on this because just the spiritual aspects alone will not be enough, or the political aspects. The dharma has to be at the root of it, and it's sad that we don't talk about this more. So I'm very glad we're having this talk today. And this is something as a society we need to focus on a lot more. And I hope we continue to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm not going to have a very long final comment. I think you guys have said it better than I could have, and I appreciate it. My only addition is, I would ask people to, look at Nithin's work and look at Aditi's work. Do you guys have anything new coming up? Nithin, I already spoke about your new project. The commentary in the Ishavasa Upanishad. Aditi, do you have anything else coming up down the pipeline?
Two books coming out, but I don't have dates yet. So
okay, well, we'll bring that up when it comes out. So I guess my final point is, Dharma, again, we've said in the beginning, and people should make this to be very clear. Dharma is that which upholds society, yourself, your family, your community, and it's a holistic way of thinking about the world. It's a holistic way in thinking about the world in a way that allows for as much diversity without the pure uniformization that in many ways the West has been trying to drive for a very long time. And I think we should look long and deep onto the fact that if you're not taking the opportunity to look at the Shastras, at the tradition, what you're basically doing is canceling out thousands of years of knowledge and culture and tradition and ideas that can really be impactful to how we can live a full and fruitful life of in love, in friendship, in community, in humanity with each other, that has a unique perspective that is very different from anything else out there. And if people's only goal is to politicize it or to attack people like Manu without reading him, I find it to be very sad, because yes, there might be things in these texts that we don't agree with, but there's so much more that everyone can agree with. These people, these traditions are complex; they're not monolithic, and we should take the opportunity to explore them, because that is life. It's not monolithic. It's difficult. It's gray. It's dirty. It's problematic, but it's also beautiful. It's all there. So the texts reflect kind of people we are, and the texts of the Indian tradition reflect the kind of people these Indians were for thousands of years. So take the opportunity, Nithin. Aditi, thank you so much for your insight, your expertise, your deep thought on these issues. I really thoroughly enjoyed this. I know hopefully we can do this again sometime soon and talk about other issues and bring more people into the mix. More of this kind of samvada with people and different perspectives is just great. So thank you both for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. All right, everyone. You can look us up on YouTube, on Facebook, on any of these social media sites. Thanks a lot. All right. All right, guys.